Karen Glasser here, and welcome to the Author Spotlight interviews with best selling authors from all around the world. So, whether you're here live or on replay, make sure to say hi in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from. Today, we are welcoming Leith MacArthur to the Author Spotlight. As a young boy, Leith became fascinated with the craft of writing after reading Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. At the age of 10, he began writing short stories and poems that kind of tended towards the macabre. 2 years later, he wrote his first novelette, Gerry the Germ. Leith went on to write 6 novels before focusing on several related stories that eventually became the William Snow series, including The Death of Harry Crow. So without further ado, welcome to the show. How are you this morning, Leith?
Hi, Karen. I'm great. How are you doing?
I am so awesome, it ought to be a sin. I'm just kidding.
Hey, wait a minute. I have to center myself, right?
Yeah, we should all be centered. We all need to center
I
ourselves.
know. Wish it was that easy. Just
I
moving.
know. Wouldn't that be easy if you just kind of arranged the camera and it would be lovely. I think we should work on that. That'd be a great, product to sell out in the community.
Okay.
We're gonna name this show today Writing to Heal. And the reason that I want to name it that is that in fact, that is exactly what your writing ultimately did for you. And I actually think it's done for so many people that have actually read what you have written. We talked about the fact that writing is kind of cathartic. So let's just start right there. How does writing manifest itself with you when you start to write? And we're going to go back to your journey and how you got here, but just right off the bat, in terms of manifesting that cathartic piece of that.
Well, I think the first time I experienced writing as catharsis was in a personal growth workshop back in my late 20s.
Mm.
And since then, through endless psychologists and shrinks, I've been told to write how I feel. I mean, everybody tells you to write that down, right? Write that down.
Right.
But the truth was that the first time I wrote how I felt better. It's really that simple.
Wow.
I mean, I could go on and on, I suppose, but why don't I try leaving it at that for now?
Let's leave it at that. And now we're gonna jump backwards. So you have quite the journey. I mean, we're not going to sugarcoat this in any way, shape, or form. So
Thank you.
let's just talk about your journey. All right. So there's drug, there's alcohol abuse, there's jail. I mean, your journey to get to where you are today was not a straight line. So let's talk about it.
Wow, it's the way you put that. It just kind of shocked me when you
I
said
know, really. But look at you. You're here. And I think that's the message. So let's talk a little bit about the journey.
My goodness. Well, I mean, I don't know how much you want me to go into it, but I did get heavily involved in drugs and alcohol when I was a teenager. And in fact, I did so because I felt responsible for my grandfather's death. That's a long story and I won't get into it. But as it turned out, I did not kill him, but I thought I had.
Wow.
And so I started drinking and drugging to cover up those feelings. And I did that for 47 years until I finally got clean when I was 66.
Wow. Wow. And you really started writing in your 30s. I mean, after being told, we talked about this even before we came on, by your mom, that this was not going to happen. This was not something you could be successful with. But you started writing in your 30s while you were under the influence and while you were on this journey. And some amazing books you wrote. But I know that because you've told me, I don't know from personal experience, but I know from what you've told me is that as you got clean, the writing got easier. So before we talk about the series of books, I want to talk about your memoir, An Artificial Life. Now, that book is actually not available anywhere, but it really is I think it describes your life, right? And it describes the futility of a life, that when you make all these decisions, you're doing it under the influence. How did this book that's not actually available, which I find fascinating all by itself, I think we have to do something about that. But in the meantime, why did you write this?
Yeah, it's interesting. You just mentioned that we should probably do something about that. I was just having a conversation this morning with a dear friend about why I haven't published An Artificial Life yet. And I think I realized that I'm avoiding it.
Really?
yeah, it's leftover energy from when I was not feeling too good about myself.
Oh,
And I think I'm just afraid to put it out there because it's pretty, I mean, it's very real. But I called it an artificial life because when I got clean at the age of 66, I realized that, to my shock and dismay, that I couldn't count on any of the decisions I'd made during the
right.
past 47 years as being grounded in any kind of reality or balance. You know, I was always under the influence of something, alcohol, drugs, various types of drugs. And therefore, how could I count on what I actually felt or didn't feel?
Right.
So for the first time in my adult life, I was feeling, I think, if you want to put it this way, correctly or more truly than I ever had before. And so I felt like everything before that time had been artificial. So unfortunately, it was an artificial life, a half a century of not knowing.
Wow. So we will talk about that after doing something with it. I mean, you say that after you were finally free of the drugs, you began to, as you say it, get in the groove of writing. What does that exactly mean?
Well, I think that you had mentioned earlier that it got easier. I don't know that it got, yeah, it's probably easier. It got easier, but it became more fluid in the sense that I didn't have these nagging agonies about
Hmm.
myself getting in the way. I didn't have my self hatred anymore. And I didn't have my history and all the terrible things I did when I was taking drugs and drinking. And so, that those impediments were no longer before me. I could just write, and I didn't judge it. I didn't judge the writing. I just did the writing, and therefore it was cleaner. And so I suppose it was easier, but it just sort of started flowing out of me in a way that it hadn't before, and it was better. It was just simply better. It was more realistic and more. It was less dramatic, less dramatized, less. It was just simpler and cleaner.
Do you think you would have been a better, different, worse writer have you had you not gone through this, which you've gone through? Do you think it has affected the way you have written and since then the way you write, or is it just several tracks going at the same time? You just happen to be abuser and you also were a writer.
Yeah, I can't really speak to what it might have been. I mean, I shy away from that kind of
Hmm.
perspective because it's not real.
Right.
I don't know. If I hadn't done drugs and alcohol, maybe I never would have written. I don't know,
Right.
but I do know that there was a clear difference. And what I also know is that I had to write. I mean, in spite of the drugs and alcohol and all the trouble I was getting myself into, and I mean, there's no question I was suffering. My soul was suffering for a long time. And so, in spite of that, it just burst out of me finally that I had to write. And so I wrote as, as drugged and drunk as I was or wasn't
Wow.
until I didn't write that way anymore. It's that simple.
So let's get into the William Snow series. How did that come to be? I know that you wrote books and then they kind of came all together and it became a series. How did this come to be? And then I want to throw up a picture of the most recent book.
Sure. Well, I wrote a few books, a supernatural thriller called The Duplicating Man, and a couple of other thrillers that were not related to each other. But then
Hmm.
there was a tragedy in my family, and it had to do with abuse, and the person who committed the abuse got away scot free, and I was enraged by it. And remember, I was drugging and drinking at the time, and I
Right.
was an angry person to begin with. So I knew that if I could find, if I could have put my hands on that guy, I think I would have killed him.
Wow.
And I couldn't, and thank God I couldn't, because that would have changed everything. But um, I sat down and I just started writing a story about a guy whose sister has been abducted and murdered, and who commits his life to finding missing children as a result of that.
Wow.
I didn't realize till halfway through the book that I was writing my anger and my hatred of that person that had done this terrible thing. So let's be clear. My sister wasn't abducted and murdered. That was just
I know that. Yeah, I know
yeah,
that.
just a so I really didn't realize until probably 3/4 of the way through the book that I was writing how I felt. So, to get back to
Wow.
what you
Catharsis.
mentioned earlier about writing to heal, I was clearly writing to heal. I mean, I noticed when I was done with the book, I didn't have quite the anger that I had prior to that towards this individual that got away scot-free. But I
It's
still,
interesting. Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying because a lot of people, will talk about journaling in the same way, where you when you can just put it all out there and write it down, it's sort of back to the catharsis. I mean, it's sort of just you get it out there and now it's there. Is it similar? Do you consider writing like journaling, or is it two different animals?
I, I've journaled also.
Hmm.
I'm actually glad you asked the question because I hadn't really thought about this, but last year I came across a bunch of journals that I'd written over 3 decades. I
Wow.
forgot that I'd done it, and I read these passages, and it was heartbreaking. I mean, I was really, really unhappy.
Hmm.
I was really struggling to find out who I thought I should be, or how I could fit into society without doing damage, the kind of
Right.
damage that
Right.
I was doing. And I saw in reading those passages that they were actually similar to the way that some of my characters felt in my stories. So
So
I think it's
interesting.
very similar. For me, I don't know about anybody else, but for me, it's been much like journaling, only in the sense that the difference being that I'm making up the stuff
Right.
I'm not
But you're
really making it
pulling,
up.
but you're also pulling from your experience and your life experience. One of the
Yeah.
books is The Death of Harry Crow. So what's this about? What's the book about?
Well, it's a strange story about an accident that occurs in which 4 people and a dog are killed,
Hmm.
and it's just an accident. Nothing extraordinary about it, other than the fact that these 4 people died. But 4 years later, after the fact, a person is murdered, and then another person goes missing, and then another person goes missing, and um, one of the people, the family of one of the people who've gone missing, asks our hero William Snow if he would look into the disappearance because he has a reputation for finding missing children. Well, this is the guy that I created,
Right.
that first
Right.
time to kill off the guy who had done the bad
Right.
thing.
Right.
So Snow sets out on this what he thinks is simply a missing person or missing child case, and he eventually discovers that there's an inexplicable link between the accident from 4 years ago and the current murder and this
Oh,
spate of kidnappings and people going missing, and it's bizarre, to put it bluntly. It's a very unusual connection, and it isn't really revealed until late in the book.
now this book is available on Amazon.
Yes.
Correct.
Yes.
So I'm going to encourage people to go on over there, pick it up, get a copy. Wherever books are sold, kind of thing,
Right.
because it's great. And I really love the idea, though, that your story ultimately comes out in your story, and I think that is basically what happens with all of us. We grab those things that have happened to us, or we have happened to it, and we pull it with us as we move forward in this wonderful thing that we call life. Um, so,
If I may, I'd just like to
yeah,
say something about writing as catharsis. I mean, it really is quite simple. I mean, a lot of people make it out to be very complicated, but I don't think it is. I think if you feel something and it's something that you cannot express, or you
mhm,
you cannot speak it to somebody, or you don't know that it's okay to talk about it, and you sit down and write that feeling out, there's no question that you are expressing yourself, and therefore you're getting out this. It's like an infection that you're opening up, and you're letting it. You're letting it out, letting
releasing
the
it,
bad
yeah,
stuff out. I mean, it sounds terribly simple, but it is. There is no question that it feels good to do that. I mean, it's like screaming. It's like the primal scream, if you remember when that was a big,
exactly.
yeah.
Well, that leads me to ask then, what guidance, what can you tell people that are want to be a writer, have been told that they shouldn't be a writer, or they don't think they have a story to tell? How do people start? What would you tell them to do?
Well, I mean, I could suggest a couple of things. both of which were perhaps the best advice I ever got about writing. One of them is to write what you know, which I know
Mm-hmm.
you're familiar with, but it really is true.
Right.
If a person, particularly if they're writing fiction
Right.
and they're creating things out of this, this fertile ground that they have in
Right.
between their ears, then they should still write what they know, which is anything that you've experienced or anything you've read a lot about. Which brings me to the second best piece of advice I ever got, which was to read, 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 and read. So the more you read, the more you understand how other people write, and you get a sense of that kind of, not, I mean, everybody has different styles, but there is a
Right.
certain rhythm and there's a cadence to writing. And I think if you read a lot, you get a sense of what works and what doesn't.
So I always like to ask the authors that come on the show, do you ever get writer's block? And
I'm
what do you
laughing because
do?
I'm in it. I'm laughing because I'm
You're
in
in it.
writer's block.
So what do you do when you get writer's block?
Uh, this is what I do. So I'm working on a book called The Weight, Weight, not
Okay.
waiting,
Mhm.
the weight, the heavy. And I'm about, I don't know, 7 chapters into it, and I've been stuck for a month, maybe 6 weeks. And that's unlike me. I write every day, every morning for 3 or 4 hours, and I almost never miss a beat. But I have been so stuck, it's really frustrating. So what I do, I have been stuck before, of course, is I just sit down and I start at page one, word one, and I start reading it. And I realize I wind up editing it. And as I edit, I start getting into it.
And
And
what
I
else?
read all the way up to where I stopped and got stuck. And then I am able to go a little bit further. I'm really stuck this time. So it's going to take a while longer, apparently, but it
That's
works.
such a great, but that's a great idea. I think is to reread what you've done. I mean, I reread my journals just like you do. I'm a journal keeper, which I'm going to have to toss all of them as I get to a certain stage because we don't want other people reading. I think our innermost thoughts. Um, so why do you do this? I mean, you could do almost anything, and you've done a lot of different things. Why have you just settled now? And not just settled now, but you are a writer. This is what you were meant to do. Why? What do you? How do you think you got here? Why?
Well, because I mean, it took an awful long time for me to figure that out.
Hmm.
I just remember as a kid not knowing what I wanted to do, although that's only after 12 when my mother said,
Right.
don't write because it just won't get you anywhere, because I stopped writing. But before that, I wanted to be a writer. I just forgot, as an adult, I forgot that as a kid, I wanted to be a writer.
Right.
And as I said before, it burst out of me, and I wrote a bunch of books and all that, but I didn't consider myself a writer. I was just somebody who was writing, but I was not a writer. And I didn't become a writer, which is what I was born to be, until I got clean, until I got clear about myself. And once I was clear of all as I said, those impediments, I was able to sit in it and just, how could I not know I'm a writer? I've written 13 books and I've written,
Right.
journals and journals and journals. How could I not be a writer? I'm a writer.
Well, you're differentiating one who writes versus one who is a writer. So there's definitely in your mind, and I can see the distinction
Mhm.
between someone who simply is writes versus someone who is a writer, and
Right.
that is who you became. We're going to give people some places that they can go and follow you
Good.
on your website, Leith C. MacArthur. Make sure you put the C in there, and
You can
on.
actually put just Leith MacArthur, and I have that domain too.
Oh, well,
So
there you go. Okay, so you heard it here first. You can put either one in and you're going to find him. Instagram, at Leith C. MacArthur. On Twitter, at MacArthur Leith, backwards. And on LinkedIn, just put in Leith MacArthur and you will find him there. Any last thoughts to our audience, to people that you know you're speaking to when you write your books? What's that message you want to make sure people walk away with?
I'm on Goodreads too, by the way. Um,
Oh,
um, could you reframe? Could you ask me that question again, please? I'm
what
not
is
sure I quite got it.
then you have to assume that I actually remember what I say 3 seconds later. Um,
Is
do you
that
have a message? Do you have a message for people? Basically, what's your message for people that might want to write or might want to tell their story or just don't know what they're supposed to do? What is your message to them?
Uh, my message is love is everything. It has nothing to do with what you asked me, right?
No, but that has everything to do with it.
Yeah,
It has
I
everything to do
suppose
with
it
it.
does. Because until I mean, this sounds corny and trite and over, until I got clean and therefore was able to appreciate myself, because it started out with appreciation, but then I eventually came to like who I am. I like who I am a lot, and then I
Right.
loved who I am. And once I loved who I was able to love freely, unlike anything I've ever experienced before. So love is really, and love to me is writing and everything else.
That's a
Good.
great
So,
answer, Leith. That is a fabulous answer,
really,
actually. Do what you love yourself, then
wow.
do what you love. That's actually very profound. I don't think you even knew you were going to do that. I want to put up Goodreads, though. I'm sure if they just look for you on Goodreads at Leith MacArthur, they
Yep.
can find you there.
Yep.
I want to thank you. This is our second time having a time to chat, and that must mean something to all of my audience because I never do repeats. But
I
I,
didn't know
I
that.
I
I
don't.
did
And
not know
I
that.
really appreciate who and what you have done and become. And I hope your message resonates with our viewers out there that your story is your story, but it doesn't stop you from ultimately, if you don't let it stop you from
Right.
becoming the person, the writer that you are. So
Right.
thank you.
Well, I thank you, Karen. I really appreciate it. I didn't know you didn't do repeats, and I'm
No, I
really
don't.
honored that. I don't know what else to say except thank
No,
you.
it was I just don't. But your story really has had an impact on me. So I really wanted to share it with my larger audience out here. So Leith, have a phenomenal day. You guys, you have a choice as to where you spend your time. You chose to spend it with us. We are eternally grateful. Go out and give somebody an awesome day, and we'll see you next time on the next Author Spotlight. Goodbye, everyone.